everyone, and welcome to the India Climate Dialogues hosted by the City Climate Alliance at the National Institute of Urban Affairs. The India Climate Dialogue is an ongoing series with our Alliance network partners, where together we attempt to create meaningful and actionable conversations. The topic that we are discussing today is transit-oriented development, accelerating mitigation, reducing inequity. Now, to give you a background, let's look at some statistics. Transport accounts for 1/5 of global carbon dioxide emissions, out of which road travel contributes to 3/4 of it. India's transportation sector alone is responsible for 13.5% of the country's energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. As a signatory to the Paris Agreement, India has pledged a net zero emission target by 2070. And therefore, we see that the transportation sector is integral towards helping us mitigate the climate crisis. However, we understand that climate change has disproportionate impact towards various sections of the society. Therefore, the premise of leave no one behind must strive to encompass them all. This dialogue therefore looks at TOD not only as a mitigation strategy, but also as a spatial strategy to enable social equity. To discuss this topic, joining us today are our esteemed panelists. We have Ms. Paromita Roy, Director of Urban Projects at the Delhi Development Authority. We have Dr. Rutul Joshi, Senior Associate Professor at CEPT University. And we have Ms. Mriganka Saxena, Principal, Habitat Tectonics, Architecture and Urbanism. I'm your moderator, Shinjini Shaha. I work as Project Officer Transport in the Urban Shift Country Project team at the National Institute of Urban Affairs. A warm welcome to the speakers and to all those who have turned in today. Let us begin the dialogue by posing my first question to Paromita, who is the Director of Urban Projects at DDA. Can I kindly request you to elaborate on what factors create a conducive environment for TOD implementation in cities? And as we understand that not all cities should take a TOD approach, in this regard, which cities should adopt a pro-TOD approach?
There is no city or village or town or even village which should not take a transit-oriented approach. If the mode of transit can change based on the context, but how can we say that it is okay for anybody to sprawl? Everything should take a transit-oriented approach. In a smaller village, the transit may be, a tuk-tuk. Maybe it's a 5-wheeler tuk-tuk. That is the transit. In a small town, it may be a small bus. It may be a large bus. In a bigger town, it may be a very good bus system or a BRT system. In an even bigger city, it may be a metro. In a region, it may be a regional rail and a high-speed rail. In a country, it may be an airline or whatever it is. But planning has to be always compact, and it has to always be public-oriented, pedestrian-oriented. And if it's not, then you're just being non-climate friendly and non-sustainable. It's as simple as that. We as planners have to stop thinking that what should happen and what should happen. We don't have to think. The villages and towns will automatically figure out what mode of transport is good for them. The main thing is that our planning has to always synergize with that transport system. It has to always be compact. So that is the message that we have to put across, that whether or whatever the context it always have to be. If you fly over Europe, you will see that the villages are all compact. So the settlements are very, very close by. The homes are very close by. That's why, French villages and Italian villages are so wonderful. They are big tourist destinations because they're all compact, walkable neighborhoods, and they are not sprawled. And then the fields are all far away, and people, cycle to the fields or whatever. But the development is very urban. Even the villages are very compact and urban. So sprawl should not happen even in a village. So it should always be transit oriented, and whatever mode works for people, they will anyways figure it out, because the mode of transportation changes from region to region. जो East India में है, वो North में नहीं है, जो North में है, वो South में नहीं है, जो South में है, वो West में नहीं है. We don't have to dictate. It's just that our planning norms now, as of today, do not have a framework which mandates compact development. And why does that happen? Why is it easier to sprawl? It's easier to sprawl because land is cheaper if you sprawl, right? So obviously people will go and buy cheap land and sprawl. So it is the easier thing to do. So we have to figure out, our planning has to figure out that what measures we take so that compact development happens, which is a more expensive model of development, obviously, because when you are making it compact, the land value will shoot up, but that is desirable from a sustainability standpoint. So that's the discussion we need to have, that how to balance, how TOD needs to optimize with the land values thing, understanding, and how to make it happen. It's a very big challenge, and hopefully we'll find the answer.
Thank you so much, Paramita. I would like to point one thing out. You mentioned whatever mode works for people, which was a very valid point when you discussed the whole TOD approach, which brings me to my next question, which is directed towards Mriganka. So as we've established, TOD is not only about climate change mitigation, but also about accessibility. And Paramita just spoke about what works for people. So with this regard, the next question is, what is the role of integrated statutory and regulatory framework in catalyzing change?
Sure. So both climate change mitigation and accessibility are key tenets that every city needs to adopt. So I think that's a given. We have to move in that direction. And for that reason alone, it's very important that our statutory frameworks actually are aligned. So if you look at any master plan today across cities in the country, master plans or CDPs, whatever they might be, most of them are premised on a growth strategy based on urban sprawl. Exactly what Paramita was saying earlier, right? At one hand, we have the main statutory plan of the city talking about growth strategies based on urban sprawl. Simultaneously, we have TOD policies or TOD strategies operating in the same city, which are based on densification along mass transit corridors. This is where the entire TOD narrative begins to fall. We cannot have two different competing growth strategies operating in one city. Generally, you might have certain areas you want to leverage on the outskirts of the city, but the overall growth strategy has to be based on compact city principles. We need to have transit-oriented cities. I mean, it's no longer about TOD, it is about TOCs, exactly what Paramita was saying earlier, right? So that's key, that our statutory and regulatory frameworks have to align. And the master plan and TOD being an integral planning framework of the master plan is critical. It cannot be a separate chapter in a master plan, right? It has to be the master plan. That's the first thing. The second key element of sort of regulatory and statutory frameworks is our town and country planning acts at the state level, right? So most of these do not go into details of what the master plan should be like. It tells you that a master plan needs to be prepared. It needs to have a land use plan. It needs to have a road network plan. It is not talking about land use transport integration in any way. That is where, again, our conflicts begin to arise. You start getting multiple documents at the city level, each saying something slightly different, right? And therefore, one cannot operationalize TOD or a sustainable growth strategy, which looks at both mitigation and accessibility. And this comes down to further, down the scale, down to regulations. It comes to form-based codes. It comes down to our building bylaws. Both accessibility and climate change needs to be brought down to the scalar approach. Even our regulations need to be flexible enough to allow for change over time. We cannot be set in stone with regulations that were prepared 60 years ago, where mixing of land uses, vertical mixing of land uses is not permitted, for example, right? Or it's a special permission that you require to mix only on certain areas. So these are the various tenets that have to be looked at. So your master plan, the most important one, the Town and Country Planning Act at the state levels, and your development control regulations down to building bylaws. If we can align all of these to be based on an approach that is looking at transit as the main organizing principle of how cities grow, we've actually moved a step ahead. I'll just stop there.
So adding on to the points that were previously discussed, we see that TOD as a concept has gained immense momentum in the last decade or so, and multiple cities are coming up with variations of transit-oriented development as a key entry point in their sustainability as well as their urban agenda. My next question, therefore, is directed to Rutul. Across Global South best practices, how do you think TOD has transformed sustainable mobility to enable socio-spatial justice for climate vulnerable communities?
Thank you. And I think both Romi and Mriganka has laid down very good ground to discuss TOD further. I think when we look at climate change, climate justice, and also what happens in our cities, TOD comes across as a very useful concept because it talks about essentially livability and sustainability in our cities. And I think, like our earlier speakers also said, that we see TOD more as a planning paradigm. It's a whole set of ideas which are put together so that we visualize or we imagine cities in a particular way. So transit-oriented cities, we are not only talking about transit-oriented development, because I think, as it was pointed out earlier, we do not want sprawling city. We do not want highway-oriented city. We do not want car-oriented cities, right? Which means that we have to work on cities which are more compact and dense. And I think let's look at three different components of the cities and see where the question of justice comes in. So city at a network level, we want all kind of areas to be connected in the city, the rich area, the poor area, the slums, the commercial hubs, the heritage part of the city. So one is that a good transit, the T of the TOD, that you require a very good transit in a city, needs to connect the entire city, and that itself create a spatial and social justice within the city. Secondly, at the area level, what is possible is that, again, if we have to develop commuter friendly areas which is connected across the whole network in the city, which means that we have to also incentivize affordable housing wherever possible on the TOD zone. And TOD does not only mean higher FAR, TOD also does not mean very expensive real estate. What TOD really means is that all kind of diverse built form are coming together and integrated around transit. And that's where, all kind of development, including affordable transit, should be there in the TOD zone. Now, how do we do that? The question of land and the land bank, etc., come into the picture. And that's why now many cities are already incentivizing affordable housing. One place where you need to incentivize affordable housing is near transit corridor at an area level. Secondly, if you are also thinking from the climate point of view, urban heat island effect, etc., TOD talks about open spaces, dynamic public realm, which is going to create opportunity for us not to go towards, sort of heat island effect. So at area level, all of these things are happening. At the street level, what TOD also talks about is creating some sort of a equity on the streets, which means that we should have decent walkable area for people, to be connected to the transit stations, and making those footpaths. Romy and Riganka has worked a lot on this. Creating decent footpaths in our cities seems to be rocket science. That maybe 5 feet wide area which is walkable at the same level, where you don't go up and down, where you continue across the junction, maybe shaded with some furniture and amenities, etc., is something that we are talking about in TOD areas as well. Many Indian cities have experimenting with street design. The first generation project in JNNURM, second generation project under Smart Cities Mission. Many cities, whether it is Chennai, Pune, some parts in Ahmedabad, etc., have tried to create more livable streets. And they are perfect streets in the TOD area as well. The other thing that we also need to do, which is also a question of justice, is how do we manage parking? Because when you park your vehicles on the street, it's almost like privatizing a public space, and you need to pay for it. I think instilling this kind of understanding in people and the user is extremely important. And then finally, coming down to the building level, and I think that's where we talked about reforming the DCRs in our cities, that we need to make more street-oriented buildings. Our buildings cannot have mindless, marginal open spaces, different plot, different design sort of a thing. We need to get some uniformity in our building design and create more active frontages, more street-oriented buildings, which are really the need of our time. Right, so we see as a TOD as a set of ideas which are put together more as a paradigm, and that's a way of planning our future cities, rather than we say that it is just increasing FAR or increasing or making expensive real estate. That's where I would also like to urge that we should look at not TOD as a mitigation part, but also as an adaptation part. Because if you are going to upgrade your infrastructure, if you are going to make new buildings to adapt to climate change, you are not going to do it in the old way, right? So TOD becomes an opportunity for adaptation also, and not only mitigation. And I think we need to look at it in the widest possible way.
Thank you so much, Rutul. So you mentioned one very interesting point, which is TOD is the place where we should incentivize affordable housing. And just elaborating on that point further, I would like to move on to the question, which I would redirect to you again. That is the concept of gentrification. So if we delve deeper, we see that transit-induced gentrification is a potential downside to TOD, and it can outrun its benefits if not harnessed properly. So from that perspective, what steps can cities take to ensure that a co-benefit approach is adopted?
Right. And I think I would say that we should not worry about too much about transit-induced gentrification, as long as we are providing ample amount of affordable housing along the corridor or along the network. I think it is more of a problem of our imagination of the TOD as a project. That, if you do one TOD project, it might get gentrified. We are talking about TOD across the whole network. We are talking about TOD here as a paradigm. And when you make like 50 kilometers of transit, 200 kilometers of transit, and plan TOD around it, the whole 200 kilometers is not going to get gentrified. Okay, there is a limit to gentrification in any city. Now you look at the cities which have been operating on public transport use, extensive public transport use, like Mumbai or even Hong Kong, you will see that not all areas get gentrified, right? Even after 30, 40 years of extensive transit use. So you have areas like Lower Parel and Parel in Mumbai, which are high-end real estate. But if you go down the corridor, you will also end up in Kurla and Mahim. So half of the Mahim is a middle class development. The other side is Dharavi, right? So it's possible that across the network in a city, there are different places who have different strengths and different opportunities. And all of them are not likely to be gentrified everywhere. So I think we often overplay the gentrification factor. There might be some spots where gentrification would happen, but what we are talking about is developing the whole network of newly planned city and of a newly planned transit. So I think that's how we need to really think about this whole problem. I would also like to sort of go back to that question that, when you plan TOD as part of your master plan, that also reduces the chance of gentrification in the TOD, because there you are looking at various statutory mechanisms, whether it is at master plan level, whether it is at DCR level. So these are all sort of can become oversight mechanisms for us to not allow certain gentrifying elements to come into the TOD planning. The other area that we can also extend our argument into is to say, see, I think our conventional planning is based on public ownership of land. What we are trying to do with TOD and other idea is that how do you also work with the markets? We are in a mixed economy where government does not own all kind of land, right? So here the private sector will also have to play a larger role in building the city. And we need to provide opportunity through systematic redevelopment planning, which is not unfortunately part of our development planning mechanism right now. So we need to make a statutory provision for brownfield redevelopment, in the existing city. How do you plan those kind of efforts? And together at the city level, master plan intervention, the DCR intervention, and urban redevelopment planning kind of intervention, together probably they will be able to tackle not only gentrification, but a lot of other issues.
Thank you, Rutul. So the idea that TOD is a project and not is treated as a project and not as a network or a concept was very interesting. And while you were speaking about how it's been addressed in Mumbai, I could see Mriganka and Paramita agreeing with you and nodding. So given that the two of you have had experience working on similar projects in Delhi, in the master plan level, would you like to add some points, add on to what Rutul just mentioned?
It's a paradigm shift in planning. It's not about projects. And we are not able to understand that. I hear this gentrification term a lot because it's a term that shows up in US literature on TOD. And that obviously it has been copied and that has been read and it is being discussed in an extremely wrong context in India. We all have colleagues in the US, friends in the US. They are reading our policies and improving their policies now. Ask Meganka. In many conferences, they come and say that we read your work and we updated our work. So we need to stop looking at US literature and we need to explore our own cities. The answers lie in our own cities, right? So let me tell you about Silampur and Welcome. Silampur is a slum. It's one of the largest slums of Delhi. It has one of the highest crime rates in Delhi. You cannot walk in those areas without protection. That is the level of crime that is there. It is an extremely poor area. And if you go even above, it is even more poor, even more dangerous. And I have personally walked these areas for years and years, right? And we still keep going back there. We keep hoping that somebody will come and open an MIG housing, will open an HIG housing here, will open some corporate office. They made a huge mall on top of Welcome Station. It has still not sold. It is still lying vacant. They are running into losses. No development has taken place. But the people of Northeast Delhi are using the metro. They are traveling. They are using that to go to their workplace in Gurgaon, in the airport, in CP, in Dwarka. They are traveling all over Delhi and they are going to their jobs. So let us understand the context very well. But it would be actually interesting in the Indian context to see how to, even though metro is there, how can we make TP schemes happen? How can we incentivize people to pool in their land and make high rises and do some good planned projects over there?
Thank you, Paramita. Mriganka, would you like to add on to this?
And I think both Paramita and Rutula are absolutely right. And I think it boils down to our incentive mechanisms, down to regulatory and financial incentive, monetary incentive mechanisms, right? So the examples that Romy is talking about, Silampur, Uttanama, etc., if we want the private players to come in, we need to make sure that our regulations actually create that platform for them to come and the market to play out. Currently, the regulations, the way the FAR as one of the incentive mechanisms, and I want to caveat that one of the incentive mechanisms is put out there, is, a number game. If we have 3 here, let's do 3.5. Or let's do 4 here. Nobody looks at whether 4 is going to give the developer a profit, whether the 4 FAR is going to give the developer ample room to create, to house the existing population in, better habitable conditions. Is that FAR going to accommodate his cost for network or infrastructure augmentation? Is that FAR going to allow him to actually build additional stock that he can sell in the market to recoup his cost and make a profit? That's the maths that we require for any of the regulations, FAR-based regulations, to actually take into account. That's why I'm coming back to the regulatory framework. The regulatory framework has to be completely in tune with the market dynamics of that city. Currently we say, the cities are so averse to changing regulations. They say, okay, if Delhi has done this, show me a regulation where the FAR is more. I will copy that regulation. Show me the regulation where parking is less. I will copy that regulation. Now, FAR of Mumbai will not work in Delhi or in Bangalore because the land dynamics are different. So, one needs to understand that regulatory provisions are a tool for us to make the market work to achieve our planning objectives. And if our planning objective is climate mitigation and adaptation, absolutely right what Rutul pointed out. And if our planning objective is making inclusive cities, then our regulations need to take a complete overall. Statutory and regulatory frameworks need to start working towards that. We cannot bring TOD as a little band-aid saying we'll do everything like we're doing. Let's do TOD. That's the magic bullet. It's not going to happen. We need to make sure that the entire environment pushes for TOD as the only planning paradigm, right? And that's the way it's going to be.
Thank you, Mriganka. That was a very strong point. We have to ensure that the entire paradigm wishes for TOD as the only planning tool. And also you mentioned the importance of contextual TOD decision making. What works in Mumbai will not work in Delhi and vice versa. So, which brings me to my next question. From an enabling perspective, what steps do you think are needed for operationalizing TOD?
So I think I've spoken about that a lot. I think the biggest thing is having a statutory and regulatory framework that is integrated, and we remove all contradictions, right? If you start reading all our acts and rules and mandates, multiple contradictions which, become barriers at every step in the process. So that's a big one. If assuming that gets done, right, and we are working towards that, a few other things, I think there are 4 other things that we need to look at. I think we need to start building excellent multidisciplinary teams that know how to do climate responsive, resilient, sustainable spatial strategies. Right? Currently, there are very few, I'm talking even about private consultancies in the country who are doing good, robust TOD plans. There's a skill, while we talk about capacity building for the public sector, I think there's a lot of capacity building required for the private players in the market. We are not getting good caliber, high quality TODs on plans. And I'm talking about blue-green infrastructure. I'm talking about, addressing urban flooding. I'm talking about all mobility aspects. I'm talking about closed loop resource management, moving towards net zero strategies, all of that. There is a capacity build, there's a massive capacity gap even in the private sector in India. And I think that needs to be addressed if we want good TODs to happen or sustainable strategies to happen. The third thing that we need is, of course, data, right? And I'm talking about granular data that the various agencies can actually put out there. Our cities are extremely cagey about the data that they own. This is not even sensitive data, right? There needs to be a push for existing data with various different agencies to be actually put out there and made available to the public. It will really up the standard of planning that happens in our cities. And I'm talking about sharing it with the private sector. There's so much that the private sector can come up with just if it had the data to work with, right? And while we're doing capacity building for both the public sector and the private sector, I think we need to do a lot of sensitization. And I think something like this is, one of the tools that NIUA is wanting to do. But there is so much rhetoric and misconception when it comes to TOD. And we've been talking about the same things for the last 10, 15 years, right? We are still debating the same things. We're still talking about, is TOD FAR? We're still talking about, will it create high buildings, tall buildings? So there needs a massive campaign on sensitization of what TOD really is. I think we really need to move away from it. Rutul does a fantastic presentation which talks about TOD myths. And I think we need to do that across the country, right? Like bust all the myths. That's the sensitization. And finally, I think we need to move very quickly away from pilots. Gone are the days where we can be satisfied and happy with doing successful pilots across the city. They're very important to, help align and streamline our processes. But I think now we need to literally go out there, start talking about TOCs, transit-oriented cities. We don't have the luxury of doing TODs. Then after 10 years, we'll talk about TOCs. I think we need transit-oriented cities now. And I think that's why the planning frameworks need to start changing. And that's where we go. So that's a lot there, but I think we need to do all of it to make sure we move in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Mriganka. So, Rutul, I'm sorry, but she dragged you into the conversation. Therefore, I must ask you to step in here and talk about some TOD myths that we really need to bust. And we'll move forward from that point.
No, I think Mriganka was being kind because I've learned a lot from Romy and Mriganka on this. But I think it's something that we all spoken about, that one is that TOD is not about increasing FAR. TOD is not about making expensive real estate. It is not worrying about gentrification, or it's not worrying about that we'll only create one kind of development. TOD is actually about, rolling in number of planning ideas together of how do you redesign our building typology, how do you redesign our streets, how do you sort of work with our areas. It's that kind of an idea. I mean, people say the 3 Ds of TOD based on the original idea that design, density, diversity. What FAR increase might partially address is only about density. Now, irrespective of FAR, our cities have always been dense, right? Our cities, by with or without planning, have always been very, very diverse. What is missing in our city is the third D, which is the design. And that's what we need to bring in at various level, at building level, area level, at street level. And that's where TOD becomes more of a paradigm shift rather than just few projects or pilot projects.
Thank you so much, Rutul. The 3D concept was very well taken. And of course, yes, design is an important aspect that has to be integrated in the entire TOD planning process. So, Parmita, there was another point that I wanted to pick up on when you were talking about the two stations in West Delhi. You mentioned in one of the stations, the metro runs empty. Nobody is using it. So this brings us to the affordability aspect of it. And as we mentioned, the point behind TOD is to make transport systems accessible to the public. Accessible, affordable public transport is what we're aiming for. So in this regard, can you give us some strategic examples on how we can address TOD from an affordability perspective?
So if you read the metro policy, TOD is mandatory as part of the metro policy. It's mandatory because TOD generates funds to balance and offset the fare box revenue. So ideally, public transport should be free. लेकिन if you make it free, तो वो पैसा कहाँ से आएगा? आपके tax money से आएगा. Are you willing to pay 10% more tax to fund the metros in the country? I don't think so. So if we are not willing to pay from our own pockets, hard-earned money, then yes. So then TOD is a very good fiscal this thing. And of course, there are others. I don't think only TOD can do it. There have to be other fiscal measures to offset the fare box revenue. But yeah, ideally, public transport should be free and there should be various methods of offsetting.
Question that Romy has raised is very, very important. The trouble in the country generally is that the transit agency and the planning authorities. And I think we need to have better mechanism that they talk to each other and make joint plans, because a lot of the time our integration between land use and transport fail is we are not very clear about who is going to make money out of this and what is going to be the revenue share. And because of that confusion, there have been sort of decades of bad relation between two sort of agencies. So if you want to do better interdepartmental coordination, sometimes budgeting it properly and doing the right kind of revenue sharing mechanism helps this a lot, and it also gives a very clear mandate. Our government works on two important parameters: one is the mandate and one is the budget. And I think the metro policy, etc., gives us a very clear mandate about TOD and the national TOD policy. I think we also have to take this discussion across the budget, that who is going to make money out of it, how much, how will it be shared, and who will make what kind of infrastructure with this money.
Thank you so much, Rutul. So with this, we come to the end of today's discussion. This has been a very interesting session of, to borrow what Rutul mentioned, myth busting on TOD. We looked at how planning has to synergize the transport system. We looked at the importance of TOD as a planning paradigm and not just as a concept. The city working at a network, area, street, and building level, a scalar approach to TOD, creating platforms for incentive mechanisms. Periodic licensing and certification was an interesting point that Paramita added. Then the importance of integrated frameworks that avoid all contradictions, that is to ensure that TOD, social equity, and climate change truly come together. And eventually importance of the right kind of revenue sharing and budgeting mechanism. And of course, data sensitization and ensuring that capacity building is built periodically, not only for the public sector, but also for the private sector, because that is where they can plug in. Thank you to all our panelists for sparing your time and being here. To all the viewers who have tuned in, please stay tuned in for more such interesting discussions with the City Climate Alliance at the India Climate Dialogues. Thank you so much.